Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Alice Hill. Uh, Before we start, I'm just going to read out a short bio from your illustrious achievements, if that's okay. Uh, so, Alice Hill is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her work at CFR focuses on risk, consequences, and responses associated with climate change. Alice Hill previously served as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and as Senior Director for Resilience Policy on the National Security Council, where she led the development of national policy to build resilience to catastrophic risk, including climate change and biological threats. Alice also co-authored her 2019 book, Building a Resilient Tomorrow, and in 2020, Yale University awarded her the Public Voices Fellowship on Climate Change. Oh, thank you very much for coming today, Alice. Before we start, I just thought if it's all right with you, I just want to prime the audience of what we're going to be talking about, the subject matter. So we've all seen the images of bushfires and wildfires on the news. But what I wanted to start with, because I never realized how much devastation they cause. So I researched it, and I found some stats. So I just want to start off with some stats to give everyone a better idea of the level of devastation. In the US, in 2019, there was approximately 50,477 wildfires. In 2020, there was approximately 57,000 wildfires. Again, in the US, in 2019, 4.7 million acres were burned. And in 2020, we saw a jump to 10.3 million acres were burned. Now, in Australia, in 2020, a massive 46 million acres were destroyed, with over 5,900 buildings and a loss of 34 lives. And one last stat, in Australia again, an estimated 3 billion animals were killed or displaced by Australia's devastating wildfires between 2019 and 2020. Now, when you read those stats, I mean, I was completely shocked at the level of devastation that's caused. I knew it was massive, but millions of acres, billions of creatures destroyed or displaced. So, Alice, what's the fundamental reasons that causes behind these wildfires?
Well, there's no single answer to this question. There are multiple reasons for why we're seeing bigger, hotter, more destructive wildfires. But one of the prime reasons that we can anticipate we'll see more of these in the future is that our climate is rapidly changing. Conditions are drier, they're hotter, and as the heat sucks up the moisture, the vegetation is more flammable, it ignites quickly, and these fires spread rapidly. When they get very large, they also essentially create their own weather. So you have this new vocabulary word, firenado, essentially a tornado-like event in the midst of a fire. We're seeing embers fly further than we are accustomed to based on our historical understanding of fire. So we are in a new frontier with climate change. But in addition, there are other reasons that we are burning more, at least here in the United States. We've seen far more development in this area called the wildland-urban interface. People want to live in the midst of a forest or right next to wildlands. And it turns out that more humans in those areas risks creating more fire because humans can ignite the fire. But it also puts more people at risk when a fire does occur. So those aspects of our choices also increase the likelihood that we'll experience fire. And then in the United States, we have a history of suppressing fire. We decided that it was better to live without fire for quite a long time, and that means that we have a large buildup of fuel within our forests. And now it's even more difficult to have controlled burns because there's so much fuel, and there's concern that those fires would get out of control.
Okay, and I imagine because the extreme, the hotter weather, the wood's drier, so it's more flammable, more easy to ignite and so on.
Yes, absolutely. It will just ignite in a second.
And you mentioned developments. Is that in itself causing another problem where the ground, if it's all concrete buildings, that the ground can no longer absorb the heat as before had it been normal soil? Is that the case, or are we not seeing that?
Well, I think in the United States, our focus on development is that more people are in these areas. And historically, you could let those areas burn because there were no people. And in our fire hierarchy, firefighters will want to save people first. Then they'll want to save structures that people have built. And then they'll want to save the wildlands. If you have a lot of people living in the wildlands, that means we're focusing very much on saving lives. And that means that sometimes there aren't enough resources to control the fire otherwise, or we would have just let it burn. And that would, of course, have over time restored the landscape. It's healthy to have fire, as we've discovered. But now, because people are living there, we work to save them and save their structures, and that just allows more buildup of risk.
Also, thank you, Alice. Also, in one of, I think it was in your article for the CFR, you talk about especially in Australia, the burning of the vegetation, and it's causing even more carbon dioxide in the air.
Well, there are multiple problems with more release of carbon dioxide as a result of burning. So as the trees and vegetation burn, they release the carbon dioxide that they've been storing. First of all, that adds to the threat of future warming because those gases accumulate in our atmosphere. They act like a blanket, and they will contribute to greater heating, which in turn will lead to more wildfire. And then, of course, when the forests burn, they can no longer serve as effectively as a carbon sink, just sucking that oxygen into the vegetation because it's now charred, and we need to wait for it to return, as it will. But sometimes it won't return in the same form as it was before. The land is so scorched that some of the plants cannot take root again, and we could see major changes in the landscape as a result of fire and hotter conditions. And then finally, with wildfire, there's a lot of smoke. And we are learning that smoke has long-term health impacts for people who work outside, just generally children, adults with pre-existing conditions, and actually all of us suffer from particulate matter that's released. And sometimes if structures are burned, of course, it's not just natural matter that's released. There could be toxic chemicals. We've seen in some areas where the piping melted, which had an effect on the fresh water available for a community in California. So many impacts as a result of what the fires do and then what they can cause to be shot out into the atmosphere that affect all of us in multiple ways.
Yeah, no, it's true. Sometimes we can think of it in narrow terms, but really it impacts on everything. And if people are living there, it's even more greater impact on utilities and so on. In your book, which we'll talk about later, you mentioned you got a term which really brought it home to me: the no more or never again moment. Do you think that's where the US and Australia are now? Are they doing enough? Is there enough resilience to stop the continuation of this trend where fires will get worse and worse every year? Is that as the proverbial line being drawn in the sand, do you think?
Well, I think we can all, every country in the world could do more to prepare for climate impacts. They are coming faster and in ways that, although they were predicted, we hadn't really gotten our heads around to adequately prepare for. The concept of no more is that after one of these terrible catastrophes, often communities will resolve no more. They don't want to see that kind of harm again. So we've seen this repeatedly through history. Recently, the Dutch in 1953 suffered a terrible flood, and then in the 90s, again flooding. And they have become, over time, the most effective water managers possibly in the world, planning for the 1 in 10,000 year event for their dikes and their levees. So they are getting themselves ready for a changing world. And then we saw in France in 2003 a lot of action by Europeans, particularly the French. There was a terrible heat wave. Tens of thousands of people died because heat is typically our largest killer. And France said no more. They have become leaders in preventing death as a result of extreme heat. And so they've seen their mortality rates decline as they've experienced greater heat with climate change. I think in Australia, you have seen responses that resemble a no more when it comes to fires. Certainly the Black Saturday fire was a huge wake-up call for many Australians as to the growing risk of fire and the need to think through how best to live in areas prone to bushfire. So you saw remarkable movement forward, some movement that Americans could look to for inspiration as they tried to determine how they should approach their growing wildfire risk. And then I imagine with the most recent fires, we will see even more action. I know that there have been numerous investigations and commissions looking at this to determine how Australia can move forward in the best manner. So similarly in the United States, we've had action, but I don't think there has been quite the recognition that on the comparable level that there has been in Australia yet to the growing wildfire risk to the United States. That may come as more acreage burns, but we're still, for the most part, very reluctant to have revised building codes, revised land use practices. There's still a bit of resistance to changing how and where we build when it comes to this wildland-urban interface.
On that point, you're talking about resistance. Do you think because there is a lot, there's the debate whether climate change is really whether man's behavior or human behavior impacts on climate change. Do you still think that's what the cause is? People have not really attributing man's actions towards climate change. That's why there's not so much action to do things.
We certainly still have some in the United States who question whether climate change is occurring, although that number is getting smaller every day. But I think it's actually more about local decision making, whether we make these changes, because they can incur, to make the changes to be better prepared, can incur additional cost. For example, to make a home more fireproof, or it could involve, if we were doing this smartly, decisions not to redevelop in areas that have already burned. I think most fire people would tell you that if it's burned once, it's likely to burn again. So maybe you don't rebuild on that ridge. And then we have a lot of existing structures that were built to much older codes. So you'll see in some places still wooden roofs, which are like putting, as one firefighter said, that's like putting a pile of kindling on top of your house. It's just going to light up immediately. So this is we're in a point of transition here, and complicating matters further beyond the expense of the home is we have a shortage of affordable housing. So you'll hear, for example, the governor of California saying, I don't really want to talk about land use because we need to be able to provide more affordable homes to people. And so shortly after a huge fire in 2018, our most populous county in California, Los Angeles, approved a development for tens of thousands of homes in an area that had already been designated as, based on historical fire risk, as at extreme risk. And then when you add in the exacerbating factors of climate change, greater heat, the dryness, that area could well burn. But we're building an entirely new development there. So this is an ongoing struggle, and we'll see how it resolves over time. Unfortunately, it may take a while for people to comprehend that the fire risk we knew in the past is not the same fire risk we face in the future. Because it's different, we need to change how we make our decisions.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, you talk about the. I read your book, and it's an excellent book. Really enjoyed reading it. And you talk about that point about our ability to imagine future risk. And you used the 9/11 example of terrorism. There hadn't been that sort of concept that terrorists might necessarily do that. I know one agency did, but it's imagining what the risk will be rather than basing it on the past. Is that a major problem, do you think, to moving forward?
That, what you've just described, the difficulty of imagining a future that does not resemble the past, is, in my opinion, the central challenge with climate change. It is extremely difficult for humans and the different methods that we use to make decisions to imagine that kind of future. Most of us, when we assess risk based on what we have experienced in our own past or someone close to us. So we assume that the last big storm is going to indicate what the next big storm will look like when it happens. And that inhibits our ability to imagine how bad these events can get, because we simply are gauging it on what has happened in the past. But of course, with climate change, we're destined to even greater extremes going forward. So that availability bias, the tendency to make risk-based decisions on what is most immediately available to our memories, is definitely an inhibitor, as is our optimism bias. We all tend to think that the bad thing's not going to happen to us. I mean, one of the more humorous, or I guess humorous, examples is the divorce rate in the United States. Everyone goes down the aisle and says, I do, and it's forever. And then we have a 50% divorce rate. So lots of optimism for all of us in getting through life. But that optimism can inhibit also an understanding of what the risks are, because we assume that it will not affect us. And we see that in our polling about climate change. Most people, 70% of Americans understand that climate change is occurring. But as you get down to, will it affect your family? The number drops into the 60s. Will it affect your community? It's 60. Will it affect your family? It's 50s. And then when you ask, will it affect you? The number drops way down, which shows the inconsistencies in our decision-making in this area. And I do think that is inhibiting us. I would add there are many tools out there to help us avoid these failures of imagination: scenario planning, modeling, catastrophe risk modeling. If we were to employ those more systematically, I'm confident that we would have better results going forward.
Yeah, you gave a good example in your book and on one of your talks at the Woodrow Wilson Center with Goldman Sachs, when they prepared, and the flood through Manhattan, where you saw all the buildings out, but they were the only ones that had power. So my question is there a difference on how the private sector deals with climate change to how government is dealing with it?
Well, I believe with both governments and with the private sectors, there's a great deal of variation in what is being done. Some communities are quite advanced, some governments, in thinking about climate change. New York City after Hurricane Sandy, as well as California, even though it's not doing land use planning for wildfire yet, is quite advanced on climate change. So you'll see some government leaders taking charge. Similarly, in the private sector, you see some private companies really taking hold and finding ways to make money in the area of preparing for climate change. But if you look across the broad swath of both governments and the private sector, my assessment is that both are largely behind. And the way we can tell this with the private sector, there's less transparency with the private sector, is in their disclosure of their climate risk. And we have a number of systems and processes for getting companies to disclose their climate risk. But I think the assessment is that for the most part, climate risk is not yet disclosed accurately by most companies, and underlying that is a suspicion that most of the companies don't truly understand their risk yet. For example, to their supply chains, to their operations, as well as to any assets they hold in the fossil fuel industry, which may become less valuable as we transition to clean energy.
Before reading your book, it's very easy to think climate change is a them thing, not an us thing. But when you look, it's an all of us thing. But when you look at the things that will be impacted from, like say, supply chain, customers, it's just, there's nothing that escapes from climate change.
No, you have stated it accurately. If we invest now in preparedness, so for example, with flooding, elevating the home now, and particularly when we're building it new, we should be investing in these materials, tying down the roof in areas that might have high storm winds, also putting vegetation that's less flammable around homes, building homes in ways that it's more difficult for them to ignite. All of these factors could save us enormous sums of money as we recover from disasters. Unfortunately, it's a little bit like the game of hot potato. Remember that game where you pass this something around and then the music stops or whatever, and somebody's left with a hot potato. Well, that's where the risk is in terms of climate change. So a developer builds a new home. Somebody's very excited. They come and look at the home, and the home is built to the latest codes, building codes. But the building codes actually don't reflect yet, in most instances, future climate risk. So you're just built safe enough for what happened in the last storm, not for what's going to happen in the next 30 years when your family owns this home. And then, but the developer sells it to you, and now it's yours. And you may be able to get insurance initially, but maybe over time it becomes too expensive because the risks increase. And so then who owns the risk at the end? Is it the homeowner? Is it the mortgage company that gave them the loan, and the homeowner leaves because the homeowner says, this home is too soggy, I can't live here? It's all a question of who ends up paying at the end. But if we could collectively recognize, yes, if we built that home better in the first place, there would be less loss across the board. We'd be a lot better off.
Yeah. No, that's very true. But it's just getting people to make that step to be willing to put that finance out at the beginning. That is very true. We're coming to the end. I'm just making sure it doesn't cut us off in the middle of conversation. I'd hate that. What I was going to say was, is there any last message that you could give to people about climate change that we really need to understand if we're going to move forward?
My message to everyone is that climate change will affect every aspect of human existence, existence really across the planet. And we need to prioritize understanding that. And the way to do that, a simple way to start on the path of understanding and beginning to figure out how to act on climate, is to simply discuss it with everyone you know. Ask them what they're thinking about climate change. Ask them what their community is doing. Ask yourself, what's my community doing? What can I do to make sure that my family, I am safer going forward? What we find is that most people just don't talk about climate change. Perhaps it's because it's such a big amorphous risk. But until we can engage in meaningful conversation about the risks that we personally face and our community faces, it will be difficult to move forward. So I urge everyone to make this part of the dinner table conversation. Don't leave it for an odd moment that never really happens. Make sure it's part of your discussions so that it's at the forefront of all of our thinking as we make choices about how, where, and how we're going to get through these very changing circumstances in the future.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for giving us your time and for explaining a lot of complex issues in a way that we can all understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you.